So here's what we know so far. In terms of geography, we have 13 colonies. We know that they've grouped themselves. We have New England states, we have middle states, and we have southern states. Most everybody has settled along the coast, but they're beginning to settle inland. We do see the formation of cities right along coastal regions because that's what makes it easier for goods to come in and out of these colonies. And we know the names of these colonies are Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. And don't be fooled, there is no such thing as Vermont, and there is no such thing as Maine. Those two states have not yet formed. Now, these 13 colonies are governed by the idea of mercantilism. And this idea means that everything that the colonists buy must be made in the UK. You could also cross out made in every single case, and you can replace it with the word shipped, or packed, or created, or sold to. Everything they did had to come through the United Kingdom, Great Britain. And that means, particularly in southern colonies, they focused on growing what were called cash crops. So that way, everything they grew was grown in quantity and it was shipped out. And this includes items like tobacco, indigo, rice, and cotton. So in order to get everything done and get all these cash crops picked and shipped and moved out, the first labor source they tried was Native Americans and tried to enslave them. But that didn't work because they kept running away and there wasn't a very big population to begin with. So the second attempt to try and find labor to do all this was to bring people in from Great Britain or from other European colonies, and they were indentured servants. But the indentured servants were really expensive, and they didn't prove to be all that useful either because these people didn't want to be where they were, and they weren't necessarily skilled labor. So the expense and the lack of reliability caused most of the colonists to turn to slaves as the new form of labor. And they went pretty much everywhere. These slaves came from Africa. They were captured against their will and brought to this country. They did not wish to be here, and so they spent a good deal of time trying to form their own revolts, trying to run away, trying to slow down work, and we will talk more about slavery and its impact on American society in a little bit. So the structure of the British government is fairly straightforward. We have two real things that we need to pay attention to. The first is the monarch, or the king, and then the second is the parliament, okay, what we would call a Congress or the legislature. The king is advised by a group of his drinking buddies known as the Privy Council. These are made up of lords, dukes, family members at first. But then eventually the Privy Council is taken over by members of Parliament. So Parliament begins to inform the Privy Council and the ministers begin to advise the king. Parliament is made up of two different groups, two houses, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Lords is hereditary, the House of Commons is elected. Where the British government starts to run into trouble is the basic idea of the king and his Privy Council are in charge of the colonies. But Parliament is in charge of taxes. And the king and the Parliament are both involved in the army and the navy, which owes its allegiance to the king, but gets paid by the taxes raised by Parliament. In the colonies, the government follows the same basic structure. We have an executive, or we have a governor, and the governor is the agent of the king. And then we have the assembly, or the House of Burgesses, in the case of Virginia, and they are the representatives of the colonists. And we see the similar devolution of power along the lines of the governor controls the military and the assembly controls the taxation, which again causes a problem because the military needs to be paid if it's going to do its job. So the question arises, does the military owe its allegiance to the assembly, or does it owe its allegiance to the governor? And in each colony, that shows up in a slightly different way and causes a slightly different problem. So if you're a colonist, you're torn between two great powers of the global stage. To the west, you have France, and then you are British. And the French and the British go to war quite often with each other and end up fighting over this territory. The colonists have to provide the soldiers, but also they have to provide housing for British soldiers, food for British soldiers, ammunition for British soldiers, shelter for British soldiers. And the British soldiers just keep sticking around because one of the things that definitely happens is you end up with a state of war that the colonists have to deal with from about 1689 all the way up to 1763. So for the entirety of your duration, Britain and France are fighting each other over your land. Land is sold out from underneath you, it is traded away as part of peace treaties, and the colonists have no say in how any of that is done. And if that isn't bad enough, then you have all the people who lived here before the white colonists arrived. All these Native Americans, who quite understandably don't want to give up their land. And so the colonists have to fight them too. So we have a series of wars that ultimately result in the elimination of Native American presence along the coast and the relocation of tribes past the proclamation line, or the boundary line that was established at the end of the French and Indian War, which leaves a large portion of Native Americans to the west of the Appalachian Mountains who are not terribly happy. So the question that you need to be thinking about is, would you have wanted to live in this? And if you did, how would you feel about it? Because if you're a colonist who lives in these 13 colonies, at the end of the day, in the middle of the 1700s, your general feeling is that you are a British citizen. And you are entitled to all the rights and privileges of the British citizens who live across the ocean in Britain. And yet, it doesn't seem that you're being given those things, and that's starting to make you mad. So what are you going to do about it? Is the final question of this unit.